The fog is the core foundation for the visual style of the game. It was the first visual asset I implemented beyond single color mesh surfaces. Some of you will probably have recognized the main inspiration for the fog, which is The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. This is an all-time favorite of mine, and I've always loved its visual style. Wind Waker's version of smoke is unique. It's flat and hyper-stylized, yet with an element of volume to it. Getting this to look right took so many iterations. I'm only going to show you the points at which I added a new layer or changed direction some way, but for everyone you see, I probably went through 10 or more rewrites. You might remember from episode 1, after moving to 3D and having to rethink the approach to Fog of War, I started with an attempt at using volumetric fog straight out of the Godot effects library. I was pretty aimless, and in my first attempts, the result was a fairly pathetic fog overlaying the entire game board. Fortunately, I had the inspiration for the Wind Waker smoke visual in the midst of fiddling with the settings, so I just abandoned the volumetric effect as it wasn't really heading in the right direction. Now that I had a focused vision, I moved to a different strategy. I created a fog overlay on top of the tile map in which fog units would spawn on each tile and be marked as hidden when inside the player's line of sight. The units were created of basic gray boxes about the height of a wall, and textured on all sides with my first custom shader. The shader took instances of a cloud sprite sheet that I whipped up and colored the sprites purple. I then spawned them at different scales along the surfaces of the box. After spawning, the cloud instances would transform the rotation, position, size, and opacity over time to create movement. I was very happy when I got the shader to do what I was thinking. This was much closer to what I had in my head. My next problem was that using individual fog units in a system with hard borders like the tiles on a chessboard makes blending the overlaps and the corners challenging. You can see some artifacts around the border of the early fog units that are the result of me trying to solve this problem. For a short time, I played around with wrapping the fog units in another semi-transparent mesh that could blend on the edges, but this was a pretty ugly approach, and it wasn't quite moving in the right direction. Instead, I rebuilt the system to calculate the area of the fog as a single region derived from the tile coordinates, render distance, and player line of sight. Using a system like this, I can layer seamless visual effects on top of the entire fog region. I rewrote the shader to apply the clouds to only the border faces, to be concentrated in the bottom 50% of the face, and to lose opacity as their Y value increased. This was intended to concentrate the cloud swirls at the bottom of the fog mesh, giving it a heavier, more substantial feel. I was starting to get more comfortable changing my shader to do different things, so I went looking for a way to bring the base layer behind the clouds some more style. This is when I found GodotShaders.com. This site has an incredible number of user-submitted, ready-to-use shaders, which are almost exclusively using open licenses, which allow me to take and adapt them for anything I need in my game. I spent literal hours browsing through different tags and trying to understand the code for effects that caught my eye. One such effect was this shader mimicking the Balatro background effect. I copied it, changed the color palette to match the black-purple gradient of the fog, and used the fog region as a mask for the shader so it only got applied to that area. After tuning the parameters a bit, this ended up layering perfectly with the cloud sprites, acting as a swirly, smoky background underneath the clouds. At this point, I turned my attention to an important problem with this version of the fog. Although the singular region had gotten rid of a lot of the hard edges, the outer border following the tile outlines still stuck out and clashed with the idea of a flowing cloud. I actually got pretty frustrated here. I couldn't figure out how to translate what I had in my head to the screen. The progress I'd made was good, but in the end, the approach of drawing flat sprites on a mesh ended up being a dead end. It was here I took a break from developing the fog to iterate on lighting and textures for the floors and walls. I'm going to save most of the details of those systems for another episode, but one important breakthrough did occur that I need to discuss. I was not happy with the flat wall texture I was using, and instead built a procedural generation system using a free pack of rock models. Each wall tile spawns in varying amounts of intersecting models at different scales and orientations, and has a built-in system for calculating a spill radius into adjacent tiles. I took this foundation for procedural generation and decided to try applying it to my fog. Using this same kind of system, I rebuilt the fog to spawn individual cloud instances instead of drawing them on a mesh face. These clouds always face the camera and have the same translation and movement as the previous version of the shader. They also borrowed the spill radius parameter that calculates how much a cloud is allowed to spill into an adjacent tile. This eliminates borders inside the main body of the fog and also lets the clouds blend with the outer edge. After getting these changes settled, I was quite pleased with the fog effects. It had a solid foundation with logic that was easy to change or add to, and had much more experience with visual effects in Godot. However, after showing the progress to my friends, the feedback almost universally mentioned the outer edges of the fog being a bit jarring. So I revisited adding a volumetric fog layer to the visual stack to help blend the border. This turned out to work perfectly to help blend the outer border and to add to the idea that the fog is heavy enough to spill over into the light. My intention after fleshing out the fog was to return to developing core gameplay systems, but I again was distracted by responding to feedback. The biggest request was a simple animation system for units and smoothing the camera motion between moves. Again, I'll save the details for another video, but adding animation sent me down yet another rabbit hole for the fog. Now that player moves aren't instant, how do I handle fading fog in and out instead of doing a sharp cut every time the fog mesh geometry recalculates? I tried a couple of feeble attempts at figuring this out before settling on the obvious approach. I rebuilt the fog region calculation to accommodate 3 separate regions. The primary region is the static fog. This is fog that remains between region change updates. The other 2 regions I call appearing fog and fading fog. Fading fog separates itself from the primary region, then fades out and gets destroyed after becoming fully transparent. The appearing fog region spawns in an individual region that starts out fully transparent and fades in over a short period of time. Once finished, appearing fog is joined to the primary fog region and the area over that region is rebuilt. These 3 regions blend together to give motion to the fog as the player moves and line of sight is updated. Here's where my development path takes a comedic turn. I had almost completely finished putting together episode 2 of the devlog when something that had been scratching the back of my head came rushing forward. While finishing up editing the intro, I was confronted by a side-by-side comparison of the fog visuals I'd developed and their main inspiration. Looking at the comparison so directly, you can probably see exactly what I saw. I had gotten so distracted with experimenting with shaders and multiple visual layers that I forgot what I was aiming for. What I had put together wasn't really anywhere close to the original idea I had in my head. So, yet again I started from scratch. I scrapped the layer stacking and the borrowed shaders and went back to the source. Instead of trying to cover the space between the clouds, I decided to try to just flood the area with overlapping cloud sprites in an exact imitation of the Wind Waker system. Individual tiles now spawn in variable instances of cloud units that cover the entire fog area by themselves, and the sole helper visual is a simple overlay on the tiles covered by fog, which darkens their color. This helps to identify tiles out of vision where the new clouds aren't quite covering all the way to the edge. This was mainly accomplished by building a brand new shader using the original cloud sprites. Instead of spawning hundreds or thousands of individual fog units managed independently, the shader uses a single multi-mesh 3D to cover the entire fog region with varying instances of the cloud sprite. This allows for pushing the visuals and customization significantly while simultaneously reducing the compute cost. The shader colors the sprites, animates them, and adds some simple subtle effects like an edge glow on the border of each cloud. The values used to spawn sprites in are calculated by a seed formula and stored in an array so mesh updates don't affect clouds that are already in place. This system also retained the spillover and region control systems from before, with some additional effects added on. I rebuilt the fade in and out animations to better fit the new visual layer, and I added logic to determine distance to player line of sight for each fog cell. Cells on the edge start with smaller, brighter clouds that pulse and rotate quickly. As the fog retreats away from the player's line of sight, they grow larger, slower, and darker. I feel like this makes the fog seem more fluid and alive, like the edges are leaking towards the light source.
One final feature I want to present is the introduction of a palette system for the fog. While the black and purple color scheme has suited me well so far in the pursuit of mimicking the Wind Waker, I thought experimenting with other colors could be cool too. I can use it to customize different levels or even specific areas. And it may be useful down the line when stuff like spells borrow from the fog system for effects. Let me know in the comments what you think about using more variety over just staying with the standard purple.
That brings us to today. That's the extent of the development of the fog system so far. It's not perfect, the fades don't always work properly, and there's no handling for cases where the player moves before a fade animation completes. The fix is likely going to be adding a queue system, so fading in or out is added to a queue that can stack up and process in order. However, I feel like this is good enough to get the idea across for now. Getting the fog visuals to this state was honestly an emotional moment. I had been focused and determined about the future of the project up to this point, but looking at the finished product here made me think, I can really do this. I can bring this to life for the first time. Many other systems have been changed and added since the last episode, and I do realize I haven't even described how the gameplay actually works yet. My next goal for the project is to finish the gameplay loop enough to have a single level demo, which I'll give to close friends and perhaps a couple of communities that I've been sharing with along the way. I have a couple ideas for the topic of the next video, but tell me what you want to know more about in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you next time.